What's the matter, man? For heaven's sakes, what is it?
He went for a little walk. You should have seen his face.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to, unbelievably, this 41st episode of The Fear of God, that very special podcast where we spend some time hanging out at the intersection of Christianity, the faith, and horror, the genre. With you, as always, is Garth. Just kidding. This is me, Nathan Rouse. Typically with me is, just longtime friend, college roommate. What other sort of titles has he held? I don't know, but typically is Reed Lackey with me. But a minute ago, when we kind of tuned in together to, get started on things, he was doing some sort of chant. It was kind of subtle and soft, but all of a sudden he just started laughing hysterically and kind of maniacally. I didn't really know what to make of things. I'm a little worried about his mental health based on what I was observing just then. And Reed, oh man, you're okay. You look better. You were looking pretty worse for wear for a few minutes there. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be having another episode, having another show. I'm actually way more excited to talk about this movie than I expected to be.
I was gonna say because you weren't speaking too highly of this particular one. And before we get too far ahead of ourselves, so. Couple bits of business. Yes, today we are talking about, and we'll get back to it, but just to put a bookmark here. Today we are continuing our walk down the Universal lot, as we explore the sights and sounds of 1932's The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. So we will return to that momentarily, but we do have some business to take care of, as we do on the show occasionally. One is, Reed, we have coming up in October, one of our forthcoming series that you and I both, and sounds like some of our listeners are getting very excited for.
Oh, yes.
In general, I'm just really pumped for some of the ideas that are percolating betwixt you and I that, the listeners aren't quite privy to yet. I just want to point out that I just used the words betwixt and privy in the same sentence.
It's what we do. It's how we roll.
It is. I love it. So, specifically in October, we are going to be talking about this new series, I Love the 90s, or walking through this series, I Love the 90s. But we are recruiting listeners, with a little bit of, like usually listeners get to just listen to the melodic tones of our voices as we go back and forth discussing such minutia as, I don't even know where to go with that one, like grand themes of Christology and cosmology on down to petty silliness like pet mice. Like it's everything in between is perfectly fair game on The Fear of God. But we rarely ask things of our listeners, but this time we are. What are we working up to here, Reed?
So, listeners, if you listened to our last couple of episodes, you already know where I'm going with this, but in preparation for our upcoming October series, I Love the 90s, we would like for you to submit to us some of your favorite films of the 90s that are going to be compiled into a list of the favorites, horror films of the 1990s. So here's what you have to do. You have to email us, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. We've already had a large number of submissions, but what we would like is for you to just email us with a handful of your favorites from your favorite horror films from the 1990s. Here's the 3 guidelines. First, you do not have to rank them. Just list them out in any order that they come to you. Second, if you can't think of 10, submit to us what you have. We had several listeners who just submitted 4 or 6. If you can't think of 10, then just submit the ones you can think of, but limit it to 10, if you would, please. The third thing is there's often the argument about is it best? Is it favorite? Which one are we going for? We're going for favorite. So there's no need to ask yourself, well, is this really one of the best horror films of the 90s? If it's one of your favorites, that's what we want. So we want to know your favorite horror films of the 1990s. We're putting together the nominations list right now. So for the next couple of months, we're going to be asking for submissions, and then we're going to take all of those submissions, compile them into a big list, and then we'll explain what to do from there to compile what the ultimate list will be. But we're very excited. I'm already really thrilled given some of the submissions that we've had. There were a few surprises on some of the emails we've already received that it just delighted me.
Have you, Reed, as you've observed these lists coming in, are there any movies on these lists that you have not seen?
Only one. I won't say which one it is, but there was one on one list that I was like, oh, it's a foreign film that I have not gotten around to yet. There's nothing then on these lists that I haven't at least heard of, but there was one that somebody submitted and I was like, oh, this is a good excuse to maybe try to watch this one. Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that series. The 90s was a good decade. I liked the 90s.
It was. Well, the one that delighted me the most, I'm going to call out, shout out to Jeff Hansen. He actually sent us a list, and like in the email, as he's going down making the list, he's like, wait, but then there's this one, and then there's this one. It was just a lot of fun to read, because at first he was awesome. Like, well, the 80s was way better. And then he's like, well, but you had this, and then this, and then this. And I think that's been the biggest thing for me is when you think of kind of classic horror, a lot of people kind of go to the 80s. The 80s was like a really big decade for horror films. And there's a lot of iconic masterpieces of horror from the late 70s and early 80s. But I think the 90s is a rather unappreciated time for horror.
They Live. I mean,
wow,
we can't forget.
Yeah, They Live is one.
80s.
They made a lot of films in the 80s, but
I just mean, masterworks.
Yeah. But no, I mean, as even some of these lists, these nomination lists are already delivering to us, it's actually very revealing that the 90s had a lot of great and surprisingly diverse films. They're not all of the same sort of tone or subject matter. So yeah, there's a lot of great stuff already being listed. One thing, I didn't plan to mention this caveat, but we had one submission that seemed to indicate there might be some confusion here. It doesn't matter if it's a film we've already talked about. I think some people might wonder like, oh, well, it's for what we cover. No, this is just a compile of favorites list. So it doesn't matter if it's a film we've already talked about. I know we talked about Silence of the Lambs last week. That is absolutely fair game if you want to hit it on your list because it was 91. But yeah, it doesn't matter if we've talked about it or not. Please feel free to include it. It's your favorites that we want.
Yes, that's going to be a lot of fun. Looking forward to that. Thank you guys for your involvement, those who have already submitted and those who have yet to. I didn't pre-brief you on this, Reed, and it's just coming to me. I do want to take a moment here, as we do occasionally. So it is significant that it is me introducing this concept. So I often, if you've listened to this podcast, maybe at least just one episode, you know that I love to give the movie Batman versus Superman a lot of grief. I am not generally an uber fan of the work of director Zack Snyder, but we do want to take a moment here. Our show is about a certain strain of media, but more than that, it is about faithful living and what that means as consumers and followers of Jesus, right. Consumers of media and followers of Jesus. And in the spirit of that, I think you would agree with it, Reed, to just sort of, take a moment and just sort of, reflect on and sort of wish well and echo the Lord's heart for the Zack Snyder family right now. Anyone who is absolutely clueless as to what I'm talking about, his 20-year-old daughter recently committed suicide, and what a terrible, horrible tragedy that is. And to the extent that our words matter to Zack Snyder, the Lord's heart breaks right along with yours and is there with you. And I don't know. I just felt like that was something I didn't want listeners to think, God, Nathan is so heartless. He just riffs on on Batman vs Superman on for a while. Perhaps there'll be a bit of a pause on that for the foreseeable future.
Right.
But nonetheless, I feel like that was an important thing to make, as we do occasionally discuss these media personalities, and whether it's Jonathan Demme or any of these other folks we've talked about that have passed away, and we recognize their work. I don't know. I just feel like that was a significant thing to address on our show.
Oh, amen. Absolutely. I'm glad you did. Yeah. Our sincerest prayers and most hopeful thoughts to the Snyder family.
Moving into a new segment, Reed, that we've just sort of instituted. Reed, I don't want to ask you just two things. I want to ask you a third. I want to know what you're watching, what you're reading, what you're listening to.
Wow. I don't have any words. There's no verbal response to such chicanery. That's not
chicanery. What's a chicanery?
If you were watching Better Call Saul, you'd know what chicanery is.
Oh, come on.
But yeah, so yeah, and I thought about that. I was like, oh yeah, what you listening to?
Yeah.
Okay, so
there you go. So yes, brand new segment, about 2 episodes old, of what you're watching, what you're reading, what you're listening to.
Sure.
Just a brief moment where we talk about the robust media appetites that we engage in, and Reed, give me one or two of what you're watching, what you're reading, what you're listening to.
Well, I'll keep it with one big one.
Okay,
and that's that my wife and I officially started Unbreakable. They're alive, damn it!
It's a miracle.
And females are strong as hell. That is okay. So I've really
this podcast is going to turn into the fear of Nathan and Reed singing. That's
so true.
That's what it's going to become.
That's a legitimate fear. That's a real horror. So Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt is alive. Damn it! In our household. I'm about halfway through season 1, and it's really delightful. Ellie Kemper is she's just adorable, and the whole show has the kind of tone. It's the kind of comedy that I really get excited about, because it's rather absurdist, but it's got a lot of heart to it, and I'm really I sort of enjoy the general undertones of theme that are not too heavy, but they sort of touch on this undercurrent of like, hey, people are people, and it's just I'm enjoying it so far. I have no idea where the show goes. Like I said, I'm only halfway through season 1.
Well, it's funny you address theme. Actually, both. Well, now, I mean, the 3rd season is out as of this recording. I've not seen any of it yet, but both seasons 1 and 2, about the midway point, the 2/3 point, really dig their teeth into some heavy thematic stuff in a way that's kind of surprising and impressive. Yeah. I mean, there are ways in which they start to deal with what does it mean for this character to have gone through this stuff in a way that you kind of don't expect.
Interesting.
Now, I will ask, are you familiar with Pinot Noir yet?
Not yet. I've heard of it. I've heard,
gosh. Yes.
So you commented on a Facebook thread of mine, and then and my wife said like, oh yeah, you don't even know what that means yet. And I'm like, okay, all right, we'll get there.
Oh, it's so funny. I love goodness gracious, help me out with the character name.
Titus Andromeda?
The gay black roommate. Yes, Titus. He's got a scene towards the end that is unbelievable. Season 1.
Oh, okay.
Where I won't even, we'll catch back up with me on Kimmy Schmidt and Titus's viral video at the end of season 1. And to your point, Ellie, is it Kemper or Klemper?
Kemper. Ellie Kemper.
Yeah. Like, she is so good at embodying that character who, like, you just believe it is possible this person is this ignorant, but also sort of like charming and plugged in. I don't know. It's an interesting delivery on that character.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So you are diving through the Kimmy Schmidt catalog. That's a lot of fun. 2 things. So I finished Fargo season 2. Very, very different bit of media consumption there. Dude, that was amazing.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's really, I mean, I can't decide which I think is objectively the stronger season 1 or season 2, but I definitely enjoyed season 2 more.
I would state and answer unequivocally for you that it's 2. I love Martin Freeman.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the tone and vibe established by season 1. I think season 2, you use this phrase a lot. I don't often. It is a masterpiece of television production. every single element of that show, of that particular season, is just expertly deployed.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really strong.
So that's a lot of fun. And I feel like we would be remiss to not mention our surrogate mascot recently appeared on SNL again, this time as one Mr. David S. Pimpkins, which was a lot of fun. So a little different what you're watching, but, kudos to Tom Hanks. I'm excited because that you would think that would mean they're aware of the value of this character and he will return. So
I hope so. But he's alive and well at the Fear of God. That's true.
He
every
is
single week.
Every week.
It even delighted me. We had a couple of listeners. Shout out Matt. We had a couple of listeners who actually start referencing David Pumpkins in their emails to us, which is just excites me. It excites me that it's catching on, and I'm enjoying it.
Well, thank you, Reed, for indulging us in a little bit of a what you watching, what you reading.
You need to stop.
What you listening to?
But it looks like you've landed on a consistent melody, which makes me happy.
Yeah, I figured you'd like that. Being the vocalist you are betwixt the two of us. So, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it. So
you ready for a little embalming?
Yeah. Let's get wrapped up here.
I like that one.
So the Mummy, prior to now. And I know we're not going to start with likes, dislikes, but I'm going to tip my hand here a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Prior to now, I would have listed, of the big 7, we've mentioned the 7 before, the core 7 Universal monster movies, which are the ones that we're covering this year. The core 7 are Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and The Creature from the Black Lagoon. So of those 7, I would have cited The Mummy as my least favorite of those 7. That has changed. I was not prepared for exactly the kind of reaction that I got out of this film. And I don't know if maybe it had something to do with the fact that I was preparing to have a conversation of the kind that we have, which I think that actually is largely to do with it, because I don't know that I would have thought about the narrative of the film in these terms were I not preparing for this kind of conversation.
Right.
But, a combination of that plus with my revisiting of The Wolfman and being actually a little bit less affectionate towards it, on reviewing. But
well, I'm looking forward to hearing where you go with that. I had a little bit of thematic stuff to discuss, but it's really not too robust. So I'm interested to see where you land us in our conversation here. I do want to, before we get into the full content of the 1932 Boris Karloff, The Mummy. So a couple of thoughts as we walk close to that shrouded figure. I don't know if you saw this. I posted this to the Fear of God Facebook page, so which means I'm sure you did see it, but you and I haven't discussed it. So this new Tom Cruise movie is the sort of launch pad. It's Iron Man 1, if you will.
Right.
For the Universal Monster relaunch.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
There's a part of me that's very curious. I don't think I'm excited, but I'm very curious.
I don't know about you. The trailer for this Mummy does nothing for me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I think there's some potential to it. But again, prior to this week when I watched The Mummy again, I have always been like, I even thought when they were starting with it, I was like, why are you starting with The Mummy? They remade The Mummy, in 99. Like, why are you starting with The Mummy? Why don't you start with something else, something that hasn't been revisited, like The Invisible Man or something? Like, why don't you start with something else? But admittedly, the trailer looks like it could go either way for me. It looks like it might be just sort of an action spectacle, which I wouldn't be all on board for. But it looks like it might have a couple of things going on. Like the Mummy is the female, which now that you've seen the film, you know that's a change. That's a gender swap from the original.
Right.
So, I don't know.
I think for me, when I watch the trailer, all I think is more Tom Cruise action set pieces. It is difficult. This is unfair towards this Mummy movie, the current one. But I see the female mystical creature, and all I think of. You didn't see Suicide Squad, did you?
I did, unfortunately.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. I saw
really?
It. Yeah.
Even after we talked about it, or before we talked about it?
After we talked about it.
What's wrong with you?
I'm a glutton for punishment.
Yes, you are. We haven't talked about this.
I will say this. I have a personal code that if I truly am not interested in a film, I simply ignore it. But once I bash a film enough, personally, I feel like I have to see it because I have to know for sure.
It's compassion. You just got to befriend the person you bully.
Well, no, it's one of those things where I'm like, if I'm trashing a film a lot without having seen it, I suddenly start to feel like I'm being unfair because I haven't given the film a chance to see if it's.
So now what? Oh,
it's garbage. I hate it.
Isn't it?
I hate it.
Isn't it?
Yeah, no,
it's awful.
I found nothing to like about Suicide Squad. Nothing.
Where I was going, and maybe this will resonate with you now, the imagery of the mummy character, the female mummy character, is resonant to me with the imagery of the big bad female villain in Suicide Squad. She's like dancing. Yeah. She's like dancing and hula hooping and doing this mystical mumbo jumbo. It's so ridiculous. It's so stupid. That's all you can call it. It's ridiculous.
Sure. Okay.
That move, like, I sort of wish we could just take a 10-minute interlude here and bash Suicide Squad again.
No.
It's so bad, but we won't. Anyway, so yes, I'm a little ambivalent. Like, you know, if this new Mummy is one of those movies where if reviews prove strong enough, okay, that'll intrigue me, but I don't know. Also, where I want to go is, I've got a fun story for you.
Oh, let me have it.
So, you just referenced is it 99 when the Brendan Fraser first Mummy movie came out?
Yeah.
So, as I was watching the Universal 1932 Mummy, I'm just, processing all things Mummy and remembering my experience having seen that one. I don't have any affection for those movies. I sound like such a jerk sometimes. Yeah. For like, I'm so judgmental, but maybe this story will illustrate why that is. So I went to see The Mummy with my brother and I think one other person at our cheap show in my hometown. And it was like summertime. I'm wearing flip flops and the person in front of us spilled their drink on the floor. It was really odd. So we're in the movie theater, and they spilled their drink and some got on my feet and was like, damn, all right, well, whatever. But people around them kind of moved away. It was a little odd. This is a true story. There's no fabrication here. About 5 minutes later, it's like they spilled their drink again. What is going on? Reed, this movie patient was barfing on the floor and had gotten sick and these people had moved away and then they got sick again. And it's like on my feet because I'm right behind them. So this is my experience of watching the
gosh. Were they like, well, I
don't know.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know.
That's a horrible story. Like that's
yes. Yeah.
I don't know why you would tell that story. Like that's so
because
awful.
That's the association I have with the Mummy.
Oh my gosh.
Someone vomiting on my feet.
Wow.
Yep, that's it. See?
There is no movie story I have that can top that. That's you win forever.
Podcast over.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
All right. So that's and I did want to know, so as we've done with a couple of these Universals, like, do you have a non-Universal, non-primary Mummy? Like, I'm not referring to Brendan Fraser.
Right.
Like, do you have a touch point that you're like a fan of or fond of or think about?
This is not totally, it's not movie related, directly, but, the Mummy ride at Universal Studios, is as creepy as any Mummy movie I've ever seen. Any. Like, it is a terrifying ride. Like, it's one of those things where it's a roller coaster. It's one of the few, like major roller coasters that they have at Universal Studios. Cause most of theirs, like Disneyland, are more theme related rides.
Right, right.
So, but it's one of the only like straight up roller coasters that they have. And the imagery is really frightening, but even more so than that, like the language is really frightening. Like it's talking about like eternal death and like right before the roller coaster takes off, it says, "Now your soul belongs to me." And then the roller coaster like shoots off. It doesn't have a slow build up. It just like rockets off. It's a frightening experience. I mean, it's very fun, but it's a really, it's kind of a creepy experience.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
All right. The only one I could really think of was, which is a really random one and you'll roll your eyes at, was, Mumra from the Thundercats.
Oh, that's great.
Mumra.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, he's mummy-esque, sort of. They're playing on that imagery.
Oh, absolutely.
See?
Absolutely. Well, speaking of imagery, so let's dive into some trivial bits. The interestingly enough, especially considering that this specific image is only like at the very beginning of the film, but the movie poster of this film specifically is incredibly iconic. It is so iconic, in fact, that it currently holds the record for the highest financial acquisition of any other movie poster in history. Somebody paid more than $450,000 for an original movie poster of The Mummy, and it currently holds the record for biggest, which is interesting because like that, the image on the movie poster, the classic movie poster, is from the opening sequence of the film.
Right.
And, you know, admittedly, most of the film, he doesn't look that way, but I just thought that was really sort of interesting that this movie poster has that distinction. The only other, you know, couple of trivial bits I'll, of course, call out, as he did for most of these. He did the makeup for Wolfman. He did the makeup for Frankenstein. The Mummy makeup, again, is the work of legendary makeup artist Jack Pierce, who, you know, accomplished most of Universal Monsters material. Also, you're probably noticing as you're watching more of these that we have a recurring cast of actors, or at least one. Edward Van Sloan has shown up in a handful of these now. But what's interesting to me about the promotion for this film is that, so when Boris Karloff portrayed Frankenstein's monster in the original Frankenstein, he was virtually unknown. He had been working for about a decade, but only in bit parts, and was not anywhere close to a household name. But such was the popularity of the Frankenstein film that when Universal advertised The Mummy, they did so with just 3 words: Karloff ... The Mummy. And that's it. No, big, bombastic, what's the story about? It's just, Karloff was a really big name at that time. Even more popular to his dismay than Bela Lugosi. And, so Karloff was
Bella's dismay or to Boris's dismay?
To Bella's dismay, yeah.
Right.
Because again, if you'll remember from our Frankenstein trivial bits, that Bela Lugosi was offered the role of Frankenstein and turned it down.
I remember those bits.
Oh, yeah. So the only other real trivial bit that I had, which is actually, I don't think this will come back up in themes. I just found it interesting. So the actress, Zita Johann, who plays Mrs. Grosvenor, she was actually a believer and a practitioner of the occult, including some of the occult practices alluded to in this film.
All right.
Yeah. And I don't know that one has to do with the other. I want to make this distinction. I'm not sure that one particular bit of information has to do with another, but she was also notoriously difficult to work with on set. Like, nobody had a pleasant time.
Of course.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know that one of those has to do with the other, but she was very, very much challenging to work with, to the degree that Universal, I think, cut short her contract.
Wow.
But yeah, I just found it interesting that she's actually was a sort of believer, and to at least a degree.
I like how you tried to distance yourself from that correlation and yet continue to imply the possibility that, in this case, correlation does equal causation, and Miss Zita was let go.
Post hoc ergo proctor hoc. That's what I like to say.
Yeah, big words on the pod.
I mean, obviously, I already talked about how I was surprised by my affection for this film this time around. How did you feel about it? I'm always curious with the Universal Monster films to see how you feel, because you're seeing all of these for the first time.
I just thought it was because you're my friend and you want to know how I feel about things.
That's true in life. But about these specifically, it's because you've never seen them before.
So I was far more engaged than I expected to be. And this is bleeding into likes, dislikes, so that can sort of technically be going into that. So, you know, when you think about the Mummy as a creature, as a character, that image of the bandaged, lumbering person coming after you is what you envision.
Right.
I was very unprepared and very appreciative of he's that for 5 minutes.
Right.
And then, like, when he shows back up as Bay, I was like, wow, I like that. Like, not even because it takes a lot, and I value a lot the element of surprise in a movie, you know, or in media,
which is tough to do when the films are 80 years old. Right.
And whether it's books or TV shows or movies, like, that's just, it's hard to pull off, especially in this day and age with modern stuff, you know, with spoilers and all the like. So I was expecting, you know, kind of a la Wolfman, this kind of slow burn, people being chased by a mummy monster. Like, I just thought that's the story I was getting. And so as you know, it's not that at all.
Right.
So that just earned a lot of goodwill very early in the movie. Ultimately, I don't know that I would say like I loved the movie, but that element really elevated my appreciation because it was so not what I was expecting. And I enjoy that.
Right. Well, yeah. And it's kind of the reverse of the Wolfman, where it's like with the Wolfman, we kept saying we're waiting for when the Wolfman's going to show up. You spend, all this time like, okay, fine. We know he's going to get to the Wolfman. And this is, they get the mummy out of the way at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And then now you're like, well, what happens next? I don't know what happens next.
Right.
Yeah, I can totally see that.
Well, and yes, what you just said is exactly it. It's when you can invoke that element of surprise. Now I am asking the question and I am paying attention. Well, what is going to happen next? I don't know. With the Wolfman, once the rhythm of the narrative clicks in, you're like, oh, well, I know what's going to happen next. We're just going to have X, Y, and Z play out,
right?
And it's kind of predictable in that regard. Whereas the Mummy is not, especially if you've never seen it and haven't read a synopsis. You're expecting that opening imagery of him, which that is another thing I wrote down on my likes, dislikes. You beat me to the punch, but I didn't pay that close of attention to who did it. But that makeup is fantastic.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's on par with anything today.
Sure.
I mean, even still.
Yeah.
You look at him in that makeup, in that casket, in those opening 10 minutes, and it's effective.
Yeah.
There's nothing cheesy about it.
No, absolutely. It's the verisimilitude behind it is even more impressive, I think, than anything that we've seen so far. The Frankenstein makeup is iconic, but you can kind of tell it's makeup. It's difficult to tell that he's not really wrapped in bandages. To a degree, he is, but it's different. He had to be able to breathe. And in my likes, dislikes, it has one of my favorite opening sequences to any Universal monster film. That is actually, even prior to the rewatch, I always noted.
Do you mean His Awakening?
His Awakening is like that. I love that moment because it's creepy. The way that it's done with really no musical cues at first. He just opens his eyes very slowly, and then while the guy's sitting there reading it, the hand sort of comes out for the scroll. It's very creepy. This could almost, it's not scary, but it could almost go in scares. Like it's a really effective sequence, and it's strong even still.
One other small thing I had on my likes, dislikes, and we can sort of move on from there, I suppose, still regarding what you might have, but is I did like the extreme close-ups of Karloff's face when he's, trying to mind control people or whatever the heck he's doing, it's like, those were like, it didn't feel cheesy. Those were very effective, extreme close-ups.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
In a way, like, it's funny you make the distinction of Frankenstein, like, in a way that the extreme close-ups in Frankenstein didn't quite accomplish for me, this did.
Oh, I gotcha.
I don't know what it was, but it was just a really effective execution of that.
Sure. Well, closing out my likes, dislikes, I don't actually know which camp this falls into, but I don't think it gets more awkward or uncomfortable than Ardith Bay staring down Miss Grosvenor like a teenage boy at a strip club. Like where he's sitting there like when he's first meets her and he's like right close to her face and then his eyes, whenever he would sit down, his eyes get like really big. He's looking at her like she's a piece of food or something. Like it's so awkward and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the other characters like Wimple and the doctor are standing around like they don't quite know what to do.
It is like should we leave the room kind of looks they're making. Do y'all need to be alone?
It's so funny to me because they absolutely it's one of the most awkward little moments that I've ever seen. And Ardith Bay is a sort of an unsettling little character in his quirks as it is, but just the way he reacts and responds to her, I just think it's so awkward.
Well, I think you're referencing the character by name there, but I think that would fall squarely into likes in terms of the unexpected nature. Like I was so unaware and unprepared that the mummy of the first 10 minutes in movie chronology 10 years later shows up as this, put together Egyptian lord. I don't know. I was like, well, that's kind of cool and totally unexpected to me. I had no idea that's where this story went.
Yeah. Well, unless you had more likes, dislikes, I really only have one scare, other than mentioning that I think the first 10 minutes is uncomfortable. My only real scare in this film, because, it's these, we've commented before that the passage of time hurts the scare factor on these films a little bit if you're viewing it with a 2017 kind of mentality. But still, when he's being in the flashback sequence, when he's being wrapped as the mummy, that's deeply unsettling. He's struggling against the bands, and they just and the camera stays on it. Like, they wrap his mouth, and then they wrap his nose, and of course they very quickly cut after that, because I'm sure Karloff had to be able to breathe. But it's really uncomfortable because the camera stays there for a while he's struggling against it. To the degree, in the evening that I watched it, my son was still awake while I was seeing it. He was in the other room, but to the degree that, like, when that scene came on, I kind of like had to turn the TV for a minute just to make sure he didn't see it.
Sure.
Just because it's kind of an unsettling little sequence.
Well, it's funny that was stuck out to you. The only thing I would put on my scares list, and I thought it was legitimately well done, is when the archaeologist assistant or whatever he is in those first 10 minutes, the one who says the incantation.
Oh, right.
His maniacal laughter. That's very creepy.
Yes.
And very, like, it was, I remember watching it thinking, wow, I feel watching this moment like I would in a scary movie made today. Like, it's very effective. You definitively feel like this character is unmoored from his rational mind.
Right.
It was very well executed.
And kind of brilliant in that it's not the reaction you would expect. You'd expect a scream, or you'd expect some blithering, so the fact that it's this insane laughter is again, it's that element of surprise. Like, that's not what you would expect as a reaction to somebody who's just been accosted by a mummy. It's really effective. I don't really have much more in those in that category, and as we've already alluded to, I think my theme might get a little robust. So I'm gonna throw to you. Do you have anything by way of themes that you would throw at it, something that you gleaned from this movie?
Well, it's funny. I listeners are going to be like, man, Nathan, you beat the same theme drum over and over. And you know what? We're at episode 41. If you stick with us, you're going to start hearing repeats and new iterations of similar thoughts. But
sure.
I don't know. I found something interesting in the sort of, there's the scene where I'm going a feminist route here. There's the scene where, gosh, you said her name already. Zeta?
That's the actress. The character's name is Miss Grosvenor.
Okay. When Grosvenor is trying to rebuff the advances of Wimple. And I just, watching it as a 2017 adult man, aware and attuned and trying to pay attention to the culture we currently live in, watching that scene was very discomforting. I don't know if you remember this. She keeps turning him down.
Mm-hmm.
And his line is, you can tell me to go to the devil, but you can't laugh at me. And it's a very interesting line, which gets played for sort of a chortle in 1932. I don't know if you've seen this with The Handmaid's Tale as prevalent as it is right now. There's a Margaret Atwood quote going around. I'm pretty sure it was attributed to her, that says very hauntingly, men are afraid women will laugh at them, women are afraid men will kill them.
Wow.
And I couldn't help but think of that line watching that scene. Like, this poor woman is trying to turn this dude down.
Yeah.
And in our 1932 sort of, male dominant culture, they'd probably watch it like, silly lovebirds, sort of. But then he says, don't laugh at me. It's like, that's a little creepy.
Yeah. And it's funny, like, contextualizing it the way that you did. I took note of that line specifically, not with that level of reaction to it, but I took note of that line and of that scene particularly. And I did sort of register, not enough to write it down because some other things were kind of going on that I'll mention in a few minutes. But I took note that's a very sort of, that time frame, you can just see I don't know if it's right to call it misogyny, but there's a lot of just sort of the entitlement in the general ether of films from the 30s.
Right.
Just where it's like, it's the conquest kind of idea. And that's the sort of tone with which he approaches that moment. And it's troublesome. You understand the kind of, we can understand that different time frames have different sort of cultural rhythms and different perspectives as such. So I won't necessarily indict them for not knowing any better in that moment. But yeah, it is with what we know now and with where we've grown now. It's a troublesome dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, like, you put that scene in a 2017 movie, and the movie is now about the dysfunctional dynamic of these two characters.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
When in that movie, when in The Mummy 1932, it's like, oh,
right.
Isn't he cute?
Right. Oh man.
Anyway, yeah. I mean, again, I know it's not as fully formed as Clarice and her adventures in The Silence of the Lambs, but that was kind of something that really stood out to me.
Sure. I understand. Well, as I'd mentioned, and man, this is unwieldy. This is a Frankenstein monster level sort of theme. So give me a little bit of space to sort of
just one sentence at a time.
One sentence at a time.
We're here.
One
We're
step,
here
one punch, one round at a time.
There you go.
But so as I was watching this film, first of all, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it and how engaged I was with it, because I've seen this film a couple of times before and really just sort of, it had always sort of fallen flat for me. I think it did directly relate to the fact that I was thinking about it in spiritual context, because that's the kind of conversations that we have here. And while I tend to do that anyway for films, there are certain films that invite it more than others, and The Mummy had never invited it for me yet. And I don't know if it was a combination of that with the fact that The Mummy happened to be, as culturally we consider most of them to be, an Egyptian mummy.
Sure.
But things were just sort of starting to connect, and some subconscious dots were starting to come together in what I was thinking about. And so, again, permit me a bit of space to sort of unpack where I'm going with this. A little bit of movie context first. So in the film, he is a character who, back centuries ago, committed what the Egyptian people considered to be a sacrilegious atrocity, to the degree that they entombed him alive, buried him alive, and scraped off the spells that are supposed to protect you from the second death, from eternal death. So they basically condemned him, as the film says, in this life. They condemned him to death in this life and the next. That eternal death.
Sure, right.
And then he awakens, and when he awakens, he connects to this Miss Grosvenor character and considers her to be the reincarnation of his, I'm going to try to say this right, Ankh Esin Aman. I'm probably saying that wrong, but
bless you.
So he considers her to be the reiteration of her love, of his love, the one for which he says he suffered more than any other person has ever suffered for anyone. And he's trying, especially in the climax of the film, to compel her to recognize her reincarnated state and to endure the horror of embalming, of live embalming, so that she can be united with him again. Because as he says, your body has a soul right now, and I need that to be in the state that I'm in, which is essentially a soulless sort of existence, so that we can be together. And he's using the language, I want you to rise again, and he's using this sort of language that at first was beginning to strike me uncomfortably, because I was like, wow, this could almost be seen, and I'm not going here, but at first it sort of struck me as somebody could say this was almost a profane reverse iteration of like Christ language, of like, oh, a moment's suffering and then you're with me eternally. And that's, that can be sort of in tune with like martyr language and rise again and that sort of notion. And so I was like, wow, what's going on in this film? And then it was finally the fact that he was from Egypt that sort of tipped the scales on what I'm about to try to unpack here. And where I'm going, to a degree, is talking about counterfeit. So a little bit now that's movie context. Now a little bit of biblical context. Enough so that you understand my point, but not enough so that people think they're suddenly listening to a Bible history podcast. So the book of Genesis details a number of prominent Judeo-Christian figures, culminating in the story of Joseph. And it's a lengthy story. I won't articulate it all right here, but it ends with Joseph eventually becoming a prince in Egypt and bringing his whole family. His father was Jacob, also known as Israel. Joseph was one of the 12 children who eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel. So the end of Genesis, the end of the book of Genesis, details how Joseph and all of Israel came to live in Egypt. The book of Exodus opens,
and that's where they talk about his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Exactly,
right?
that's exactly right. Hey, that is. I mean, that's the story.
I actually really like that musical.
So then in Exodus, it opens with a sort of a brief preamble that anchors my thoughts here. You would pass over it almost as prologue, but it says,
"Was that a Bible joke?"
What?
You said you'd almost pass over it.
Oh, that's not a Bible joke. No. So it's something that you would probably just skip through to get to the meat of the story, but it says that the people of Israel were living and multiplying in Egypt, and a Pharaoh was born who did not remember Joseph. It says that just in passing, that a Pharaoh was born who did not remember Joseph. This Pharaoh, because he did not remember Joseph, was concerned about the encroachment of the Israelites on Egyptian territory and therefore put them in slavery. And they lived in slavery for 400 years. So follow me here, that if a Pharaoh rose up who did not remember Joseph, it stands to logical reason that a generation rose up in Israel who did not remember living outside of Egypt. They had no context for anything other than life in Egypt. And then they're enslaved. And they're enslaved for 400 years, which means generation after generation after generation rises up in slavery. Their only cultural context beyond the traditional stories passed down by their forefathers is life in slavery in Egypt. That's all.
Sure.
So here's where I'm going with this. We know that when they were out in the wilderness, one of the sort of often teased elements of the Israelite people is that they constantly ragged Moses. We would have been better off in Egypt. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and bring in the scripture because it's important to this context. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 3 says, "The Israelites said to them, 'If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death.'" Now, what listeners who may not be as familiar with biblical context might not know is that at that moment that they're in the wilderness, where are they traveling, Nathan? They're traveling to the Promised Land. They are on their way to the Promised Land. And as they're passing through the wilderness, marching through the Promised Land, they continually regret having left Egypt. They continually regret having left their pot of meat where they had all the food that they wanted to eat, but they were enslaved. And here's what I was thinking as I was watching this mummy try to woo this woman. And he's trying to invite her like, hey, be gridlocked in with me. Like, that's where you really belong. Be gridlocked in with me. And is using this kind of eternal love language. You know, he's like, we'll enter into love that would, and he even says to her, love that would do you harm, love that might do you irreparable harm. But he calls it love. And what I kept scratching at is I kept scratching at this idea that for this generation of people, they had grown up in slavery. Slavery was all they had known. But also, their only, again, this is a logical presumption, their only real context for freedom was the freedom that they saw exhibited by who? The Egyptians. The Egyptians was their only concept of freedom. That they're there in slavery, but to them, it's logical for me to assume that their concept of freedom is not a home of our own, a different land, and elsewhere. It is here, free in Egypt. It's logical to me to presume that that's their sort of context for how they want to be delivered from this. But what is the Lord's intention throughout the entire book of Exodus? To bring you out of Egypt, to get you out of there entirely into a new land, a new place, To give him, at the time that the people are delivered from Egypt, they have no 10 Commandments, they have no law, they have no cultural structure, they don't have any of that yet. But that's part of what the book of Exodus sort of lays out, is that the Lord wants to draw them out of that environment and wants to bring them into a home of their own. Now here's where I'm going to try to calm myself down, because I can feel myself already sort of getting fired up. I look at the mainstream language of the church today. I look at the larger sort of evangelical world and the larger sort of evangelical language that usually uses scripture to try to appropriate what they are saying is godly and righteous. And I want to try to avoid using they as much as I can, and just sort of say like, hey, there is a way in which you can project that kind of language as very godly and righteous. But the whole time it reeks to me of the kind of language that only has a freedom concept within Egypt. In other words, we're going to be free in Egypt. We're going to be free by the terms of which we have seen the rest of the world.
Right. I was going to say, and even in using it that way, I think in print you would put quotation marks around the word free, right?
Right.
You know,
yeah, exactly.
We are. Do me a favor real quick, and maybe it was just a rabbit trail, which is totally fine because we do that. I like where you're going. Was there a direct connection between where the establishment and the movie?
Yes.
Like what was the?
Yeah.
Okay. Were you getting there? Have I jumped the gun here?
No. I probably didn't make it well enough because I kind of skirted past it. Whereas just he's inviting her to what he is claiming is like her destiny, eternal relationship with him by going through this moment of torment, and then he's inviting her into that. But he is a counterfeit of that. He's a counterfeit of love. He's a counterfeit of life. He's not life. He's not love.
Or into the context of where you are going, it's freedom in Egypt.
Exactly. You know? That he's inviting her into freedom that is still bondage. But he's inviting her to be like him, as it were. And that's sort of more the connective tissue, is that he wants her to be like him.
I can see
that. And the people in Israel, I can perceive their only concept of what it meant to be free and to be, autonomous on their own would be what they saw the Egyptians being. But that's not what the Lord desired for them.
Yeah, I don't know how you might reestablish where the construct you're building outside of this very specific conversation, but I really like where you're going with that, because so much of, I will draw the clear lines between, I think, what you are presuming is implicit in what you're saying, that, you use the Joseph language and the generations betwixt Joseph. I just love that word this evening. The generations, from Joseph to, where scripture in Exodus begins, and the commonality, the commonplaceness, the presumptive culture that establishes itself around these Israelites, and let's juxtapose that with the Jesus of Scripture and the time since then and the generations that have grown up in let's call it Egypt, if you will, that presume a freedom that is not such.
Right.
I think is sort of where you're aiming with that whole construct. Yeah. And I feel like there's so much to be mined there in terms of, as we sometimes do, we'll probably end up drifting far from the strict text of the movie. But yeah, what a powerful image and necessary reminder that it is. And hear me, like I appreciate the compassion you were exercising a minute ago and sort of checking your language of they and this sort of stuff, because it is difficult and sometimes impossible to, of your own strength, jar yourself out of Egypt. Yes. Mentally, spiritually, psychologically. And if anything, it feels like this image just came to me, and it's kind of interesting based on this context. I was trying to picture a dragging, a falling into, and I pictured an upside down pyramid, which is fascinating imagery for an Egypt conversation. But this way in which we keep being drawn into this deeper entrenchment of quote unquote freedom in Egypt. Right. In our current culture and society, in a way that is sympathetic, right? I mean, like, I don't not understand it.
Well, and to go even further than that, why did the people of Israel keep wanting to go back to Egypt? Because the way into the promised land was hard. It was difficult. That was why they kept wanting to go back, because to do this, they had to get uncomfortable. They had to let go of all of the sort of creature comforts that they were used to. They had to depend on God daily. Like they didn't have any food. They didn't have any water that he didn't provide for them. They had to get into a place where they could not sustain themselves. And that frustrated them day in and day out, to the degree that they said it would have been better if the Lord had killed us in Egypt rather than us be led by the Lord into life in a home and a promised land that is our own. And
is there nothing more threatening to corporate faithful living than mass comfort?
Yes.
And, safety in concert.
Right.
Like it's funny. You're brushing up against a lot of thoughts I've been having lately. Just, are they born directly of themes you're talking about here or not? I'm not real sure, but I was telling my wife the other day about how I feel like using your imagery. I mean, it's the biblical imagery, but you're utilizing it in a context we can all sort of wrap our heads around in terms of present day. But to me, there's this way in which faithfulness requires constant discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
And man, we hate that.
Yeah.
I hate it. I'm not patting myself on the back at all.
Right.
I mean, every second you're spinning one plate, 15 others are falling to the ground. It's
right.
The temptation exists to just let them all fall to the ground and just call it good.
Right.
But a thought that came to me recently was, just this, and it may have been one of our podcasts, but like, the new wine of today is in an old wineskin tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like, this is sort of what you're talking about in a very perfunctory fashion is you've got to keep alert and attentive and pressing. And the wilderness is treacherous.
Yes.
But promise is waiting.
Yes. It's the way home is the thing, is that it's the way home.
Yeah. Yeah, as in wilderness is the way home.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Because that's what he was wanting to do. And that's what I keep scratching up against and that's what largely I was unprepared for this film to sort of dig up in me, is this understanding that there's this constant, and this is what it was, is that the mummy in the film is using language that I would easily say in a different context is similar to sort of the language of, eternal,
right.
This is our home, this is our destiny, all this kind of thing. He's using that language, but he is a counterfeit. He is, and she says, it's kind of silly to bring this up at this moment, but she says at one point, save me from that mummy. It's dead. Save me from that. It's dead. And that's what I did write down one quote from her that sort of, helps to sort of articulate this. She says to him, I loved you once, but now you belong with the dead. I am Ankesaman, but I'm somebody else too. And then she says, I want to live even in this strange new world. And it just bowled me over because she's saying like, hey, that may be once who I was. Maybe once I was a slave in Egypt, but I'm somebody else too. And I want to move into this strange new world. You've talked before on the show about that Eugene Peterson quote of entering into a mystery that
right.
I want to live.
Let go of my expectations and enter a mystery. Yeah.
And that's the thing is that's what this is it's letting go of the concept that we have always so frequently defined as freedom, which is defined by the Egyptians, by what we've seen in the world around us. So we, as faithful followers of Jesus, have to...
Which, let's be clear. I know I'm jumping in and that's rude, but let's really be clear here. You are saying Egypt, but what you mean is dominant culture.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, oppressive, dominant culture.
I know this
lavish.
I don't even mean oppressive necessarily. I just mean like when we are talking about Egypt, we're talking about what is the dominant culture that you are living in.
Yes.
And that could be Constantinople of hundreds of years ago between now and Egypt. It can be today.
Yes.
The United States of America.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is the dominant culture and its rules and its mores that you get intoxicated with, that I get intoxicated with, that we get intoxicated with.
Yes.
And enjoy to our detriment.
Absolutely.
Hear me. I feel I need to back off a little bit from some of the strength of that specific language, because I do think the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof.
Yes,
and
yes.
there's a way in which abundant life does not mean a petrified life, if you will,
Yes.
an ignoring of all things good.
Mhm.
But there is also a way in which Egypt is inside of you.
Yes. And we mentioned on the Frankenstein podcast, talking about how they eventually come to a place to where they fashion from their own gold an image
Yes.
that they then call God. Like, it is so deeply within them. Egypt is so deeply buried in them. And I wrote another thing that this other theme sort of overrode, but I talked about unearthing buried evil. Like when they were, they dig up the mummy, and then that's what sets him free, obviously. But that idea of, like, it is so deeply within us that we will fabricate gods, and we will call Egypt home, and we will believe that the only home is Egypt, and that the only power is Pharaoh, and that the only thing we can possibly do is find a way to be comfortable and at home in Egypt, when the whole time the Lord is drawing us to this other kingdom, this other home, this other world, drawing us out into something that is immensely more free and immensely more beautiful and immensely more ours, as it were. But we keep clinging to the things that we have known to be our comforts in Egypt. And that's something that really was just, it's gnawing at me in a way that I couldn't even begin to fully flesh out on this one conversation. But this idea that I look around and I hear people justifying things in both directions. I hear them justifying things using biblical language that I know deep within my heart to be so contrary to gospel kingdom living, but they're using biblical language to justify it. And they're using some sort of moral, righteous high road that they see it as some justification for treating people horribly and treating people as less than people. Or they're doing so in such a way that just fashions themselves in a position of power and comfort. And that couldn't be more Egypt freedom. That couldn't be more like I want to live like the Pharaoh. I want to live like the guys in the palace. I at least want to live like these people who are beating me with whips every day. I want to live like those people. Instead, what the Lord comes to do in Moses is shatter the chains and to break the power of Pharaoh and to show people that there is a home beyond that one, that there's a way to live that is beyond what you have seen, what you have known. But it's something that, just as I was watching it, when I turned it off, I almost couldn't sit still, because I was sitting here recognizing like how much of a counterfeit has seeped into our hearts and our minds and our souls and our spirits, and said, like, this is the kingdom. Egypt is the kingdom that God promised you. And it's not. It's not. We've believed that we can eat the fruit and that we won't die. We've believed that we can completely abandon the what the Lord came to give, which is empty yourself, lose your life, and find it. And that's something that we just don't have a tendency to do.
The flames are roaring, but the good flames, the Holy Spirit flames, not the, Sheol flames.
Sure.
But, this is why anyone who follows me on Twitter or anything like that or might occasionally be like, "Dadgum, Nathan, you are just anti-America," or if you just listen to the show, maybe you infer that some. I would never claim an ardent patriotism, but this is why. It is exactly what you're talking about. It is not that you can't live in a natural country of parameters and borders that has a sort of niceness to it. You know what I mean? Like, go live where you want to live and enjoy that place.
Right.
But the trouble is the intoxication of Egypt first.
Yes.
If you will.
Right.
That says, whether you acknowledge it consciously or not, allegiance to Egypt overrides anything else.
Right.
Somehow Egypt is embodying biblical principle, biblical whatever.
Yeah.
When in fact, as you're establishing, Christ would say, what I keep coming back to, this is an odd image, although I feel like it's worthwhile. I keep coming back to, and these are phrases and concepts that, even 2 years ago, I would have a great deal of naivete towards, but gerrymandering.
Right,
You're familiar with this?
Yeah.
This sort of false outlines of counties and things like that for voting purposes. I think about that image with the kingdom of like, we really want America to be the kingdom.
Right.
But really it's this, diverse tapestry with strange Rorschach looking lines all around it that weave in and out geographically. Does this make sense at all?
Oh, yes, of course.
I don't know. I think about that a lot and just how, I don't know, man. I get so sort of disheartened by Egypt love.
Yeah.
See, I'm even trying to be sensitive there, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like it is disheartening to feel like, I'll put it this way. Christ just always wants better.
Yeah.
For you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just period.
And
like,
has better.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Wants, has, and is better.
Yes.
And we just, it's the C.S. Lewis, we settle for mud pies sort of imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
We play in the mud and I want to be sensitive and cause I am a firm believer in revelry and joy and, joyful expressions of faith as legitimate that don't fit into a very prescribed quote unquote evangelical mold. Oh, you gotta have your fall festival and not your Halloween party. I think those sorts of distinctions are stupid. I mean, clearly I'm part of a Fear of God podcast, but so I am very much an advocate for enjoying life in a way that is not abusive to yourself or those around you.
Right.
So I would not say, don't drink, don't smoke. What do you do? I just think there's this way in which we get intoxicated by the dominant culture of Egypt and forget that it isn't. Here's my final button on this, and I'm sure you'll have more.
Just one more thing.
It isn't that it isn't our home geographically. I'm not talking about geography, but it isn't our home.
Right. Exactly.
I think, and what I mean by that is I think people often get confused when you talk about language of home, not you Reed, but you Christians. When we talk about language of home, they think, oh, well, yeah, that's right. Heaven's my home. Sure. Mm-hmm. But that's not what I think scripture is a lot of times talking about. Like,
I agree.
It is a present, imminent, tactile, physical, tangible, perhaps geographic home.
Yes.
It just doesn't abide your national borders and parameters and lines.
Because, and I didn't look the scripture up, but because Christ told his people the kingdom of God is not going to come by your observation. People are not going to look and say like, oh, there it is, because he said the kingdom of God is within you. So yes, I agree. Heaven is our home, but more so Christ is our home. And the fact that we have within us the capacity to bring forth the kingdom in any everyday situation and conversation is our home. And I think that, let me be clear about this. I am grateful, and it does not sound like it, but hear me distinctly. I am immensely grateful that I was born an American. I love this country. I am proud to be living here. The fact that you and I can have a show like this and talk about what we talk about, people have fought and died to protect the liberty that we have to talk about that. All of that is absolutely of the essence, but foremost, I am a follower of Jesus Christ. And foremost, I am a believer in the gospel that broke the power of sin in this world, that broke the slavery and the bondage to sin. And I think more so than that, we have a responsibility, as it were, once we've heard this language, once we know what is before us, to live accordingly. To cast off everything else,
I'm sorry to jump in there, but even, use your own language here. You said that broke sin. I would say Jesus calls us and says, and points at Egypt and says, this isn't best, right, great, or home.
No.
And friggin' get it through your skulls.
Right.
Like, I'm sorry.
No. All I was going to say is that, it's one of those things where we would look at this and say like, yeah, we're not denying the potential goodness and good qualities and things we have to be grateful for living where we do and when we do. But it is of the utmost essence that we remember that it is not where we belong. And it is not what we are pressing forward into. That is of the utmost essence. Otherwise, we will start deceiving ourselves to believing that Egypt is our home and that Egypt is the kingdom that God has promised us. And it's not. He wants to draw us
Right.
out of those mentalities, out of that bondage, out of that way of thinking. And it's hard to cross the wilderness and enter into the promised land. Not everybody makes it. Not in Exodus and not according to the scriptures in toto. But the fact is, it's difficult and we must press on because there's a home waiting on the other side of that we're constantly being drawn into, and that we have, as Christ promised us, some measure of within us at this very moment, that it is at hand, as he called it. Yeah, I'm just going to have to stop because otherwise I'm just going to go. And yeah, I wasn't really ready for what this idea of looking at the mummy as a counterfeit for life and a counterfeit for love did in my heart in thinking about this larger context of the history of Israel and Egypt and how that all sort of connected to me. But yeah, so there you go. There you go, listeners.
Yeah. Well, hey, it's not a fear of God episode if one of us doesn't just catch the fire of the Spirit and just burn up and get engulfed in flames.
Well,
I don't know, I kid there, but I think there is weight and gravity and importance and significance and faithfulness to what you are trying to articulate that this inspired. That, man, it is a constant need to be conscientious of the Egypt in us and around us and above us. Because even something that I thought about a minute ago, you were describing the value of living in the time and country we do. And my immediate thought is you and I appreciate that value in a way that not everyone does. And what I'm saying specifically is not everyone has it as good and right and well as you and I do.
Right.
And I think the call of home, the faithful kingdom says it is a place where all are available to mercy, grace, and love in equal measure,
right,
of any stripe and color, creed, what have you.
Right.
And that is where we get drunk, is thinking, look how good I have it, forgetting the person next to us doesn't get to quite share in that level of goodness, quote unquote, that we do.
Yeah, no.
Anyway.
Yeah, I completely
I need to shut up. Or we'll just
yeah, we'll
get revved right back up.
Yeah, we'll have to just sort of cut this off here. Although, we still have our David Pumpkins to go into for the mummy. I think now's a good time to say that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but it's not the end of the conversation. This conversation could go on for hours. But I'm going to stop. I'm just simply going to say, sincerely, with no tongue in cheek whatsoever, God bless America, sincerely, but Christ is life, Christ is liberty and freedom, period. Egypt is not our home.
Right. All right, let's pumpkin it up.
All right.
So, as we always do, we're going to rate by our favorite metric, that of numbers of David S. Pumpkins in 3 categories: style, scares, and substance. Today, specifically referring to 1932's The Mummy.
Show.
So Reed, style, I am going to give, out of 0 to 5 David S. Pumpkins, purely for the sort of surprise factor. I'm going to give this a solid 3.5.
All right.
3.5.
3.5. For style, I'm going to go ahead and give this a 3.5 as well. And honestly, prior to the rewatch, I probably would have given it somewhere close to like a 2. But yeah, I think that I was just really surprised at how much I enjoyed it. So 3.5 for me as well.
Sure. And what about scares for you?
Scares for me, honestly, I admitted it's not a terribly scary movie. Although there's a couple of unsettling moments. I'm going to land at a 3.
Oh, wow. That's higher than I would have expected based on that, preface. I think for me, it does not betray a lack of liking, as evidenced by my style grade. I'm probably going to go like a 2 on the scares factor.
Gotcha.
And if I'm honest, that might be hedging a little more favorable. I mean, I found that scene I referenced pretty well executed scare wise, but other than that, there wasn't a whole lot.
For the opening sequence and his being wrapped in the mummy sequence alone, that's where my
great.
came from.
Yeah, so, that was great. For substance, I'll lead the charge here. You built a very good case for where your brain train took you. I think you brought a lot more than the movie necessarily has in it itself. So I think I would settle kind of at the 2.5 substance factor.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think that a lot of that was just what it was raising up in me and what I brought to it versus what's in the text of the film. So I was actually but because it did that, I'm going to give it a 3.5 for substance, because I do think that,
that's fair.
I mean, it's going to those places. So yeah, that means, why don't you give us our David S. Pumpkins score?
Today, 1932's The Mummy, we give this movie 6 David S. Pumpkins. Any questions?
So, yeah, 6. I think that's
All
fair
right.
for The Mummy. I think 6 David S. Pumpkins is fair and good.
Yeah. It's a classic.
So,
It's a classic.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you want to continue this conversation, I know that, I've gone off, but, so if you'd like to, continue that conversation about The Mummy itself or about anything that we've talked about in this conversation, you can feel free to do so in a variety of ways. You can reach out to us on Twitter. Nathan, what is our Twitter handle?
At the Fear of God.
You can also like us on Facebook and follow us there. You can leave a comment on one of our posts. There's a link there through Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at Reed Lackey. And Nathan, where can they find you on Twitter?
At the Nathan Rouse.
You can also email us, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. All one word, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. And not only to discuss The Mummy, not only to talk about what we've mentioned here, but also to leave us your hashtag I love the 90s list of your favorite horror films of the 90s. Please continue to send those submissions if you've not done so already. We love getting them, and we can't wait to see what you guys come up with. You can also go to morethanonelesson.com to leave a comment on one of the official posts there. And if you listen to us through iTunes, please, we would love to have a review in any capacity, but especially a favorable one. So please pop over for a few minutes and leave us a review on iTunes. And otherwise, Nathan, thank you so much for indulging me in this ridiculous brain train that I'd accumulated, but for having this conversation.
Certainly,
with me in
my
general,
friend.
as always.
Yeah.
So, I should mention what we're companioning this with. Next week, we went a little bit of an unexpected direction.
That's not unexpected.
So, we're going to be visiting a film that I'm actually very excited to talk about. A film by Don Coscarelli called Bubba Hotep, starring one Bruce Campbell and Ozzie Davis. A little bit of a sillier entry, but with a surprising amount of heart to it, and maybe a surprising amount of substance too. We'll see when we have that conversation. But check that film out as a companion film to The Mummy, Bubba Hotep, and we will see you next week to talk about that. Nathan, thank you very much as always.
Yes, sir.
We'll see you next week, guys. Bye.
I just read I was looking at my notes for Bubba Hotep and read would you like a ding dong line?